So recording in progress. Welcome to lecture 2 of Social Media at Work. Thanks for being here at this early hour out of your own free will. Of course, it's pretty easy being at home. Last year in my other course, I asked my students how many of you are still in bed and how many of you are actually dressed and up and ready. Turned out that about 30% was still in bed and 70% was already up and ready before the lecture. So welcome. What we are going to do today is, well, we're going to talk about enterprise social media, but we still have some things to discuss from the previous lecture. So I suggest we start with that. So let's see, I have the first lecture here somewhere as well. So if you remember, well, it's not that long ago, of course, but we discussed, we had a big discussion about how technology will change organizations and how the pandemic and the new generation entering the workforce will change organizations. And we talked a bit about the role of technology in that process. And we ended with something called social materiality, which is the integration of technology and more human factors. And the central premise that there's an interplay between technology and organizational and human and societal factors. Today we're gonna discuss that further, and we're gonna explain two approaches that are based on social materiality but are a bit more concrete. But first, I want to start with a theory about. Bless you, Koen.
Oh, sorry.
We'll start with theory about network individualism. So I didn't get to that last lecture, but network individualism is basically a more scientific view on what happens in society and how a society changes. It's by Barry Wellman, and he created a theory about network individualism, not necessarily about organizations, but it really applies very well to organizations. So he distinguishes three eras in which society was and is organized in different ways. But if you look at how people organize themselves in organizations and how, based on the discussion we had last Monday, how people will most likely organize themselves in organizations and across organizations, this theory applies really well to organizations as well. Let's start. Network individualism. Barry Wellman distinguishes three eras in society in which people organize themselves in different ways, and he calls the first stage or the first era little boxes, which basically means that well, if you look at how society was organized basically before 1900 or so, people were mostly locally based. So if you look at how people lived, they lived in their own little village, and everything they did was in that little box with only very few or relatively few people they interacted with. So people were member of a few groups with clear boundaries. It was pretty hierarchical and structured. It was really bound by place and time. So you have to remember that like before 1900 or so, if you lived in a village here, or if you lived in Tilburg, and you wanted to go to Breda, that was really like, oh, it took you a half a day or so, so people were mostly they lived in their own village and they hardly went anywhere. So social activity was bounded by place and time, and the dominant mode of communication was face-to-face. quite interesting is that this is how society was organized before 1900, but this also is really how organizations were, and some still are, organized. So if you look at how organizations functioned, well, in the 1960s or so, I don't know if any of you have seen the series Mad Men, about a marketing agency in the 60s. You see it's very much organized like this. So people in organizations, they work their entire life in the organization. They have contact with, yeah, I also laughed and hated it at the same time. So they had fairly little contact outside of the organizations. They usually work for a long period in the organization, maybe their entire career. So the way that people organize themselves in organization was quite related to this theory of little boxes as well. But then think of what happens in the next, what happened in organizations after the 1960s, and in society, what happens when we get the technology to communicate and also to to travel more easily. And Wellman says, well, then we enter the next stage of network individualism, which is called globalized networks. And here we see that it becomes easier and easier for people to also communicate and socialize and organize themselves across those little boxes that we had before. So society becomes increasingly connected. But still, the main type of organization is in those little boxes, and there are relatively, well, there are more and more connections, but still people organize themselves mostly still in fixed groups. And that's basically how we live now. So people have different social networks. They are a member of different social and organizational groups. It doesn't necessarily have to be based on physical location anymore, but it can be based on, you can become a member of everything. If it doesn't matter what you're interested in, there's always a community of your interest online. So psychological neighborhoods become more important. So communities based on common interest. So that means that social, as it is called in the theory, social networks become disembedded from place. So the physical place is less and less important for the social networks you're a member of. Though it's still important, of course. So we're still very much tied to a specific location, especially if you look at how work was organized in the 1980s and 90s, etc. So we call that globalized networks. And you see this both in society and a bit later on in organizations. So from the 1960s onwards, and especially since the 1980s, 90s, that we see a globalization in society. We see the advent of easy accessible communication technologies in organizations, email, etc. Access to phones. That make it easier for organizations to organize themselves more globally and not in fixed places. But in society, you see this earlier. It's not really related to social media, but I think it's quite interesting. So if you think of this stage, the little boxes in which people are really tied to place and time. One technology, not a social media technology, but one technology that really changed the way that people could organize themselves was the bike. And that may sound strange, but there is a pretty famous sociologist who studied how the invention of the bicycle, changed society in the Netherlands. And because now with the bike, you could reach the next village. Suddenly your world became much and much bigger. And there was really, especially with the people with a formal function in those little villages, or in every village, like the pastor from church and the mayor, etc., they were really worried that they would lose all the social cohesion because of people having access to well, to such a relatively simple means of transport as a bike. Which I think is quite interesting, because nowadays you see the same, I think, with the what are they called? The electric scooters that you can rent. Can someone help me? Yeah, go check. And you have other ones as well. Yeah, Felix. Yeah, which makes it increasingly easy to travel around. So you can always take a Felix or a Go scooter and go somewhere. And well, when I was young, not everyone owned a scooter. I owned a what was it called? A brommer, schakelbrommer. What's it called in English? Help me. Shakel? No, just kidding. Moped. Yeah, that's it. With shift stick. Sorry, I'm really getting ahead of myself. But it's pretty interesting to look at these scooters and how they also change the way that you travel. You know, it becomes easier and easier to take an Uber, or to have Thomas to take an Uber, or to take a Felix scooter to just travel somewhere else. Yeah, sorry. It's called globalized because it's between local and global. Because in this stage, you see that people are increasingly connected. So it becomes easier and easier to communicate with people from other networks and to become a member of other networks. But still, the main way to organize yourself, as well, the main way that people organize themselves is still in those little boxes. So you are a member of more little boxes than before, but still the main way of organizing is in relatively tight-knit communities. And that's what Barry Wellman calls globalized. So it's global, but we are still in local communities. And local doesn't mean physically local, but can also mean psychologically local. It becomes more and more clear on the next slide. And if you look at what happens, this is really how we live now. And this is, I think this is kind of how people live, or how people prefer to live. So we need the psychological safety of a fixed social network, but we also need more broader social contacts across those networks. And we'll get there in a couple of other lectures. Yeah, exactly. So later on you have more little boxes. Now think about how you organize yourself. So you're a student, you're maybe part of a sports team, you're part of your family, you have your work. So there are a lot of little boxes that you're a member of. But if you think about how your grandparents lived, they had far fewer boxes and far fewer means of communicating across those little boxes than you have. And I also think that this is really the core of human interaction, you know. So when we had the Corona measures, you know, when we had the curfew and we couldn't see people, we got really frustrated because we had to stick to our own little box instead of the more broader way of organizing ourselves. So this is how we are now. But what Wellman says is that he predicts that we will organize ourselves more and more in a way that he calls true networked individualism. So he says that we will lose those little boxes and we become more and more individuals in a network. And I think the pictures here sum it up really nicely. So here you see still those little boxes with tight-knit connected communities. And here is just individuals in a network. So, and that's why he calls the second stage globalized, because it's right in the middle of this and this. So he predicts that from the 21st century onwards, we will organize ourselves more and more as individuals in a network. So our connectivity is not across those little boxes, but is really more individually based. We are able to switch networks more rapidly, so become member of different project teams or different groups when we want it. So it's easier to stop being a member and become a member of another group. And what he says, each person separately operates his, or yeah, he says his, but his or her network to obtain, well, everything, to obtain work, social support, etc. And he also says we are able to do that because our roles become more narrow. So we become specialists in our, especially in work, we become specialists in a certain area, and we can do that everywhere. And that really relates to what you said last Monday. So the younger generation really is not really tied to a single organization. They can work everywhere. They are really experts, so they have their own corporate identity or personal image, and they use that to work in different project teams. Yeah, so you're absolutely, so student associations are really more localized. So this networked individualism is, well, as I said here on the previous slide, I think this is the more natural way of people to organize themselves. And Wellman poses this networked individualism really as a as one polar opposite toward on the other end of the spectrum as the little boxes. So this will never happen in full, but he says that so that network individualism, that we go towards network individualism more and more. Yeah, good that you say that, man. Thanks. So weak ties become increasingly important because you need, in order to organize yourself in such a network of networked individualism, you need a lot of connections. So, for example, yeah, you can switch more easily. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you need those weak connections to switch more easily. So think about your LinkedIn or your Facebook or your TikTok. Don't know if you can do that with TikTok. I'm too old for TikTok. But think about social media, and every social medium allows you to have all those connections. So, for example, if you have your strong ties for social support, but for example, if you're looking for a new project, if you're looking for a project team as a student, if you're looking for a new house, then you call upon your weak tie network and ask everyone you know, can you help me out? And that allows you to switch more easily and get into contact more easily with different networks. But like I said, still, so this little boxes was the main way of organizing before, but of course it was never the case that there was no interaction between those smaller groups. There were always some connections. Similarly, this network individualism will also never happen. So there are just two opposites of a scale. But I think it's a very useful way to think about work. quite fun, by the way, that you talk about student associations, for example, because quite recently I learned that a contest is a thing here in the south of the Netherlands, because we never heard of it. So I'm from above the rivers, and above the rivers we don't do that. And I think that's a good example, I think, still of a kind of a globalized network. You know, it's something that you do in a certain area, but there's not enough connection for it to, well, to become global. Yeah, I really missed out. Yeah. I heard. Even yesterday I heard that I should really join a contest. So organize one. So, okay, let's get back to the lecture. Sorry. What I think is very interesting about this theory. So Wellman developed it in the 90s, and the paper is from 2002, like even before the advent of social media. But he really predicts very well how we organize ourselves more and more. So if you think about what we discussed last Monday, how we think work will, the way we work will develop, how we think organizations will look in the future, really is more and more toward the network individualism type. And if you look at how people work in organizations nowadays, people work more and more in different project teams. So you're not a marketing manager for product X, but you're part of different project groups in your organization, and you work in different virtual teams on different projects, maybe even in different roles. And that is what happens more and more in organizations. So I think it's quite nice that Wellman predicted it very well. So if you look at how organizations function now more formally than we discussed last Monday, so you see that organizations cooperate increasingly in the form of networks instead of fixed hierarchies or other ways of organizing. And the nodes of a network, which means you are the node in a network, are increasingly connected by communication technologies. So if you look at modern day organizations, there is more and more of a network logic in those organizations. So you as a person are a node in a network, and because of social media and other communication technologies, you are in a network and you are well connected to other people. It's more flexible and adaptable. There are fewer and fewer gatekeepers, which means fewer and fewer managers who tell you what to do and who to work with. And you really need ICT and or social media to handle this. So you need those new communication technologies. I will not show this video now. It's like a commercial video for a bank, or ING in the Netherlands. But if you look at that video, they describe the way their organization functions, and it's absolutely similar to network individualism. So they say you have different segments, different departments, each with their own goals, each with different people who work on projects. And once a project is done, the project team dissolves and you become a member of a new team. So, and okay, why do I spend like 15 or even more, maybe 20 minutes on this topic? Is because if you look at what social media is, it is really about connecting people. So I think this way of looking at networks and looking at organizations as a network is really similar, or really ties well into what social media does in organizations. Okay. Finally, now, well, it's not really a very important slide, but if you because it's kind of a repetition, but if you look at what Wellman calls fishbowl work, because it's, if you look at a fishbowl, it's a little box, versus a network professional, which is what we are. You can see how people are different before from that they are now. You have clearly defined work. You are now part of a network. You was loyal to your organization. You are now loyal to your career. So basically everything we discussed, and then you came and you brought in last Monday is on this slide. So that was the first thing I wanted to discuss. So we already discussed social materiality. So we discussed that. So of course, what Wellman argues, that we organize ourselves more and more in terms of network individualism, is not something, you know, it's not a law of nature. So this happens because of an interplay between people and technology. So like I said, the bike in the early 1900s made it possible for people to organize themselves in to extend their network. But it was also people who wanted to extend their network. Similar with the advent of email in organizations became more networked. But it's also because there already was globalization in and across organizations. So this network individualism is because of the interplay between society and organizations and technology. Okay. So that's why social materiality is important. So we discussed this last Monday. So it's the interplay between technology and human factors. So now we continue with the discussion about technology, and then we get to social media, and then we tie that back together to network individualism. So if you look at how we as scientists think about the role of technology in organizations and how technology affects organizations and affects society as a whole, you can classify basically all theories across along two polar opposites. So on the one hand, you have theories which are quite deterministic. So they would say, you know, it's really technology that gives a push to organizational change. So for example, because we invented the bike, people started to extend their network. So it's really technologically deterministic. On the other hand, you have constructivistic theories, which argue the other way around. So they argue, no, it's because we wanted to extend our network that we invented the bike. And they're quite opposite, and you have certain theories which really are on the technologically deterministic side, and theories which are really on the constructivistic side. And we try to be somewhere in between. So you don't have to remember all those theories that are mentioned here. You just need to remember the two opposites. So, and it all boils down, of course, to the interplay between technology and its surroundings. So like I said, hardcore determinism is technology has a direct and certain impact. Hardcore constructivism says no, it's really the people who determine a technology's meaning, uses, and outcomes. And of course, both views have their drawbacks. So because it's not only the technology that affects outcomes, it's also how we use technology and how we want to use technology that affects how technology is used. For example, you know, we invented the emojis. The emojis were not part of are now an integrated part of your mobile phone and of your WhatsApp. But it started out with, you know, someone saying, well, if I use a colon and a parenthesis, it looks like a smiley. And then NTT Docomo in Japan, a network operator, thought, oh, well, maybe we could do something with that. And in 2000 or so, they incorporated that in their phones. So they saw something happening in society. So people wanted to use emojis and using that with their keyboard. So they implemented the technology in the mobile phones. And now we have those emojis. So those emojis were invented in Japan. And if you wondered why so many of these emojis you have on your phone are Japanese inspired. That's why. So here again, you see the interplay. So there's no, so both hardcore determinism and constructivism are wrong, and the answer is really in the middle. If you ask people to think about the role of technology in organizations, people have like a natural tendency to immediately have a deterministic view. So, for example, these are some covers from Time magazine over the years, which are all really deterministic. The porno plague, the video games and violence, the strange world of the internet, the death of privacy. So it's really, oh, we have a new technology. So technology will absolutely affect the way society functions. So, and it's easy to think that way. It's easy to think, okay, face-to-face communication is the default. So we should definitely use something like Zoom, which is really similar to face-to-face communication, because then communication will be most efficient. But it's really deterministic. It's really thinking about, okay, we need those technological characteristics and they will affect people in that way. So that is not what happens, but it's still what many people think. So technological determinism is really technology giving structure to human thought and behavior. It's a technology that determines how we think and how we are affected. And in organizations, you usually see both dystopian. So in society, you usually see dystopian views of technology. So every science fiction movie is a dystopian view of technology. While in organizations, you usually see utopian views of technology. Okay, if we just implement Microsoft Teams, people will magically start communicating with each other. And does any one of you work in an organization where they recently implemented Microsoft Teams or Slack or another enterprise social media? Because I'm quite curious about how it's used in the organization. Yeah, a lot of people. So is someone willing to explain that a bit? How Teams or Slack is used in the organization? With audio.
Yeah, sure. I can explain. So recently at Heineken, introduced Facebook Workplace, and our current issue is about adoption. Like the company, the organization. Oh, this is internal Heineken, not the beer. It's more the Heineken company.
Yeah.
But so the biggest problem at the moment is like they spend so much money on this social media enterprise, but people are not using it because they've got concerns about, oh, it's Facebook and I don't have Facebook, or they're going to take all my data, and basically what happened is they did away with email and then brought in Facebook Workplace to try and make it more of a easy connected, stay connected environment, but people really aren't using it. So we don't really have the best experience with it.
Yeah. And is there any, can you come up with any solutions to how to get people so far in using it?
So at the moment, we're doing a lot of campaigns, starting with like the C-suite executives, and then sharing content, just basically a whole educational campaign.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I think in the coming
challenge, it's really a challenge.
Yeah. It is. In the coming weeks, we'll discuss a bunch of strategies with which you can convince people of using and adopting such a technology. So especially in the one about knowledge management virtual teams. So we discuss a bunch of those tactics. Thanks. Get back to you. Is anyone else who's willing to explain a bit about, for example, Teams or Slack? That's the hard thing about anyone? No.
I can do Teams maybe. Sorry.
Ah, yeah, thank you. Yes.
I'm trying to turn my camera. We introduced Teams because they wanted to move away from the internal drive, and also at one point we had Skype, Teams, and Outlook, and also an internal drive. So the problem now is like they're trying to get everyone to use Teams for all the video calls, all the event planning, and then also to use it as sort of like a drive where they keep all the files for all the teams and different things like that. Oh. But they also have an intranet service. So there's there's files on the internal drive, the intranet, the Teams, and on people's personal computers. So it's just kind of a mess at the moment.
Yeah. And is Teams used a lot?
Sorry?
Is Teams used a lot now?
Just mostly for meetings, and then there's some people who are really trying to convince people to move all their files there and move all the team files there. But so for my team, yeah, we use it for pretty much everything. But I know for a lot of teams, they still like to use the drive, or they like to use the internet, because it's the whole process of moving everything over.
Yeah. I can imagine. I think it's very similar to us. Here at the university, so we also switched to Teams very recently, and with the whole package, so the whole Microsoft suite. So we now have OneDrive, in which we have to store our files. We have the Teams for we have to use Teams for meetings. We have Teams for internal communication, but it's really not used at all. So for starters, because for example, for our IT department. Has made it so that every time we log into Teams or OneDrive, we have to use two-factor authentication. So we always have to allow access via our phones, even if we already do it on the same computer, which really hampers use. Also because we have now, I think that's the same case in many organizations. We have email, we have WhatsApp, we have now we're pushed to use Signal. We have Teams, so it's just a bit too much.
Yeah.
So in my company, luckily they already merged everything together in Teams. So we even have the intranet and all announcements, which is very helpful and organized. Yeah. That's super. But what I think is interesting that you need a kind of a you need kind of a management push in the adoption of these enterprise social media, but it doesn't. It shouldn't be a hard management push. So it should be okay. We organize everything in Teams, but then you still need to have all the social adoption process of people starting to use it, because social media is quite bottom up organized. So if you're really hierarchical in use, then people will have all kinds of issues with, okay, why should I contribute? That's something for in 2 weeks. My dad works with two-step verification like well, for an American company. That's more hesitant. Well, yeah, it's just, I think it's a bother to every time I want to log in my OneDrive, I have to acknowledge it on my phone. So if you really want to push also the social media functionalities of Teams, so me being able to use a WhatsApp-like or chat-like conversation in Teams, then I won't do that every time I have to use two-factor authentication, and we just use WhatsApp. But it's a very important point, because it's not only a technology thing; it's really also a cultural thing, not only a national culture, but also really depends on organizational culture as well. So you're absolutely right. But you see that it's off. So in many organizations, when people adopt Microsoft Teams, management has those magic bullet expectations. So if we implement Microsoft Teams, it will solve all our communication problems. So people will magically start communicating with each other, which doesn't happen. So this is a really utopian view of technology. So we'll get back to that next week and in the coming weeks about how you, like I said, how you can counter that and how you can have a more bottom-up approach to stimulate enterprise social media use. So I think I already said that. So like from the Sanctus and Poole quote, so once the technologies is applied, there's a belief that it will automatically bring productivity, efficiency, satisfaction to individual employees and organizations. And it's from 1994, and like 30 years later almost, this is still what many people think in organizations. Let's see if we are all, oh no, I have some time left. But like you see in your adoption, in your own organizations you work for, it's people who develop technology, you know, people who use technology, people who adapt technology, people who select certain technologies to use and appropriate technology. Appropriation means using a technology the way you see fit. So for example, you can use Microsoft Teams for many types of communication, and you see that many organizations have different ways of using Microsoft Teams. It's a kind of a it's how management pushes the use of Microsoft Teams, but it's also like a more bottom-up norm development. So people in the organization decide for themselves, okay, for quick communication we will remain using WhatsApp, but for more formal communication we use Teams, or maybe the other way around. So people have freedom in how they deal with communication technologies and how they use it, and that freedom, that is what we call appropriation of technology. So that is determinism, and constructivism is the other way around. So they say, for now, it's really the people and society and changes in society that determines how technology is used. So technology is not an autonomous force, but technology is kind of neutral, and we, the people, define the use and effects of technology. So basically they say, they say technology is kind of written, like some people call it. So it's written by inventors, investors, competitors, designers who write, which is a theoretical term for the whole design process. So and the use process. So people they write and they endue the technology with their own needs. So technology is structured by human thought and behavior. And that's the example I showed on Monday, you know, that artificial intelligence and machine learning is a technology, but it's only as good as the human input it receives. But of course, that is also not what happens. So technology is never neutral. You know, you have technologies have certain characteristics. You know, if you have a gun, you can shoot. It's pretty obvious that you can shoot that gun. So it's not that you can use it to make a cup of tea or something. So it's so the technology also determines so the technology also affords a certain use. So people who are leaning more towards a hardcore constructivism have a difficult time explaining what the role of technology is. And that is why we have social materiality, and they provide really the linking pin between determinism and constructivism. But I think, like you have noticed, it's really more a philosophical idea, so an interplay between technology and its users, and a really practical theory. And in order to make it more practical, many different theories are developed. And I think adaptive structuration and the affordance approach of social media, I think those are the two most useful theories to take social materiality into practice. And that's what we're going to do now. So I suggest we have a break, let's say 10 minutes or so. Yeah, and so we continue at 9:40, and then we, then we only start the second lecture. So let's meet each other in 10 minutes. You can get a cup of coffee and go to the toilet, and I'll See you in 10 minutes. Recording. Okay, welcome back. Recording is in progress again. So let's continue. So the whole discussion about determinism and constructivism before the break reminded me of a tip a student gave me yesterday about a lecture on free will by Hans Doornmalen. So it was about, do we have free will or don't we have free will? You know, that they say that if you have free will, that's actually determined by your unconsciousness. It's it's philosophically quite interesting, because determinism and constructivism is quite the same. So determinism would say, okay, you have no free will because we can always predict the effects of technology on people. While constructivism says, oh, we have free will and people are really able to do with technology whatever they want. So I kind of realized relates to philosophy and philosophy of science as well. Okay, but now let's make it more concrete. So let's first discuss enterprise social media. So I think it's good to work towards the definition of what social media actually is. So before we dive back into the theories. So could you give me, you can do that in the chat, but can you describe what is unique about social media? So what are the characteristics of social media? So if you think about, well, enterprise and normal social media, you know, from Slack, Facebook, etc. Okay. Let's go. Interactive sharing, online identity, connecting people like that fast. Yep. Form little boxes. Just kidding. Sharing about yourself, two-way user-generated content online. Sharing user-generated content online. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Better? Communication, okay. Access to personal data. So there are a bunch of characteristics of social media. And if you look at these, some of these are like more like consequences of social media, and others are more characteristics of social media. But you see that if you look at the if you look at the okay, let's quit the joke here. So if you look at the characteristics, they really relate well to what we discussed before. Of course, you know, it's interactive sharing, communication, your own little boxes, connected. Oh, yeah, sorry, sure. I forgot identity, which is quite important. Yeah. So those are all, I think, pretty well tied to well, everything we discussed. So if you look at Barry Wellman's theory about especially the globalized stage and network individualism stage, you see that you can form your own little boxes, you go and communicate with other people and other groups. You can create an online identity, so your own little box with people who share your little box. So social media really ties well into the globalized network ID, but it also really ties well into the network individualism ID. So you create your own identity, you can connect people, it's fast, it's worldwide. So if you look at the characteristics of social media, they really are very similar to the characteristics of network individualism and globalized networks. And that's why the theory of Wellman is so important, because I think it really nicely links societal and organizational developments to social media and its characteristics. So let's see if we can reshape this into a formal definition. I don't know, does somebody want to have a go with a formal definition of social media? You can do it with audio. You can also type it in chat. Like one wonderful addition to Zoom would be if you could see that there are people typing, because now I don't know if everyone is just silent or you're busy typing something in the chat. Well, okay. Thanks. Okay, we're getting there. Let's see. Oh, there's a lot here. So we have websites and applications that enable users to create and share content or to participate in social networking. That's Google, but it's actually a good definition, absolutely. So it's create and share content. So creating, sharing is very important, and social networking is also very important in social media. I think those are the three main characteristics: LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and so forth. Online communication platform which allows users to connect and share information with each other all around the world. I think that's also a good definition. Platform used for online interaction. I think that's a very interesting definition, because I'll get back to you about that in a moment. Oh yeah, fast anonymous. Oh, that's also, anonymous is also an interesting characteristic. So let me get back to the last 2 points. So there are basically two definitions of social media. So we have a more broader and a more narrow definition. So the more broader definition could be all mediated interaction. Like Ivana said, platforms used for online interaction would be a more broader definition of social media. But let me ask you a question. Is Zoom, so what we use right now, is this social media or a social medium? And I don't have an answer, an objective answer. Do you think this is social media? No, really, no. Okay. Anyone? Yeah, thanks. Because you can't share or create content except for chatting. Yeah. It's not many to many. Well, isn't it many to many? Does WhatsApp fit in this broader definition? You tell me. It really depends. So if I sometimes give lectures to younger people, people who are still in high school, and if I ask them, is WhatsApp social media? They say, yeah, of course, WhatsApp is social media. But if I ask them, is LinkedIn social media? They say, what is LinkedIn? And if I ask them, is Wikipedia social media? They say, no, of course, Wikipedia is an encyclopedia. It's not social media. If I give lectures to people in organizations and I ask them, is WhatsApp social media? They say, no, WhatsApp is not social media. It's not many to many. But if I ask them, is Wikipedia or a corporate wiki, is that social media? They say, yes, because we can edit. We can all create content on Wikipedia. We can edit that content. We can have discussions. So it's definitely social media. So it's also a generational thing. What you think social media is? Yeah. we are able to share things ourselves as well, but the lecture setting doesn't allow us. Yeah, I can easily, change the settings now, and so that you all can share the lectures. And I don't. Can you annotate now? Can you write on the? Yeah. I should not have said this. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted. Yeah, so this has some characteristics of social media. So you can annotate. So there is something like user-generated content here. But we have some hesitance because it has to do with, and then you say has to do with access. And I think it was George. I don't remember. Someone who said it is not many to many. Oh, Saskia, sorry. And I think those are very good points. But can you, Saskia, could you say how many do you need before it becomes social media? Okay. Okay. So for example, we are now, well, it's a lecture, so it's not, but we could use Zoom for at least few-to-few interaction. So, and if someone else cares to comment, of course. So what is many? Do we really need many to many for social media? Jolien says, I think the content part is an important feature of social media. If we don't consider WhatsApp as social media, what LinkedIn does, I think it's about sharing content with others. But sometimes the option to seclude parts for the bigger audience. Yeah, absolutely. You really good definition. I think many to many is everyone has the possibility to see or listen. But with a Zoom meeting, you need a link and password. Yeah, that's a good point. Not really. I think you have to be able to interact in order. Maybe in social media, they have to act, right? Yeah. So you see with the comments coming in, interaction is also possible with 2 people. So I don't think you need many people. So with the definitions coming in, the many to many is the difficult part about defining social media. So because certain people tend to define many to many, like in one-on-one is 2 people is many, and other tend to define social media on the other end of the spectrum, and they say it needs to be public before it needs to be social media. Yeah, so like George says, and then says critical mass. Yeah, I'll get to the persistent later on. Yeah, so I really like the discussion because you see there are different perspectives on it. Many to many is the difficult part. So let's start with if you look at the narrow definition here on screen. So let's start with the user-generated content part, because that is what sets social media apart from more traditional types of media. So for more traditional types of media, it's more of a sender-receiver thing with little options to feedback, watching television or a corporate magazine or a corporate newsletter. But every social media is more about user-generated content. So even a thing like YouTube, which is of course can be sender-based, but everyone can upload YouTube content. Everyone can comment and like YouTube content. And if you look at basically all social media, it all boils down to like bottom-up communication and everyone being able to create, edit, or revise or extend upon existing content. But this is of course pretty broad, because this would mean that WhatsApp and all the hearts you give me on screen now is also social media. But I think this is like a core characteristic. It's more of a bottom-up type of communication than a top-down type of communication. The email is I would not classify the traditional email in terms of social media. It's more an interpersonal it's more interpersonal interaction, because the feedback is quite limited on social media. So of course you can reply, but the whole more interactive process of creating content together and to have like a quick, fast way of reacting is not really present in email. Yeah, it's more like a communication tool. But it is quite interesting, because that's why many organizations, as the example that one of you gave earlier, are now switching to Teams and are trying to replace email with Teams, so that it becomes more social media like. Now, WhatsApp is also a communication tool with added functionality. So, for example, you are now part of different WhatsApp groups. You know, you are talking about me in the and about the course in the social media work app group, and you're talking about the program as a whole in the master WhatsApp group. So because WhatsApp is more many-to-many and more quick than email, it has more social media characteristics than email. But I think, yeah, social media is also best defined on a continuum. So not necessarily it is or it is not, but WhatsApp has more social media type functionalities than email. So user-generated content is one, and many-to-many as well. So we would say a phone conversation is not social media, but if you have a WhatsApp conversation with many people, it is more social media like. So the many-to-many thing is also an important characteristic of social media. But it kind of depends on the type of social medium and on your personal definition to what extent, you know, how many to many you think it should be. But in general, we tend to define social media as communication technologies that are to a certain extent public and visible. So like Twitter, that is really Twitter is really, of course, you can hide reactions or disallow reactions, but in principle, what you tweet and is public and everyone can reply to it. Get back to FaceTime in a moment. So Twitter is really on one end of the many-to-many spectrum. It's really public. But if you have a traditional Facebook group, that is not very public because you have to become a member of the Facebook group, or but within that Facebook group, it's public. Similarly to your the public aspect adds to the definition of social media, but then the question is, how would you define Instagram? Would Instagram be a social media? And would Instagram stop being social media if your Instagram is private? Or even if your Instagram is private, do you still think it's social media? Now, Willemijn, get back to that in a moment. So what do you think, everyone? So is Instagram social media? Yeah, you can still scroll through other people's posts. share a post publicly, the public option, who follow me still makes it public. Yeah, with your weak ties. Yeah, so even if you have set your social media more considered general public, yeah, so social media is open, you still see other posts on which you can comment. But even if you have set your own social media, Instagram to private, you still have like, 500 connections. So it's still to an extent public to your weak ties. Yeah, and those 500 connections can screenshot it and communicate it. So you don't know what happens. That's the persistent part. Yeah, sponsored pages. Yeah, so yeah. Yeah, so I would define, because if we say it has to be public, then it would be impossible for an organization to have an enterprise social media, because it's almost by definition not public, because the organization, of course, has its own Microsoft Teams environment, which only people from within the organization can access. So I would say that it should that many to many, the many to many aspect of social media means that it is to a certain extent public and visible, so to a large enough network. So even if you have set your own Instagram to private, there are still a lot of people who can see your content, and you can still access other people's content, even when it's not entirely public. It's still, you still have large enough of a mass to, I think, call it social media. There was a question about one too many. Not one person too many, but one too many interaction. I have to scroll back a bit. Yeah, why is it many too many and not one too many? Because one too many interaction is really is television, newspaper. That is really old-fashioned. Mass media is really one too many. So you have one sender and many receivers. And for example, even in so on Instagram, you can post pictures or reels or whatever on Instagram, but other people can as well, and people can really interact with your content. So therefore it's many too many. Yeah, one-way communication. Yeah. Thanks, Isabel. Yeah. So yeah, this is what we do as scientists. I think before this lecture, you had a pretty clear definition of what social media was. And now we have made it more and more difficult to think about what social media is. But I think it's good to think about these characteristics and know that these are integral parts of social media, but it's not that clear cut. Can you consider our comments here one too many? Now, I think your comments here are many too many, because you can react on the comments you give here. I can react on the comments. Even my lecture is in a certain way many to many interaction, because you can comment on my lecture. It's not really many to many, because you cannot really, because there's also kind of a top-down thing here, because I'm the teacher. But it has many to many characteristics. Yeah, pre-recorded would be one too many. Yeah. So this, I think if you would have a regular Zoom call, it would be more social media like. But because we are now also in a kind of a teacher-student setting, it is less many to many, which is kind of a constructivistic view on social media. So we use in a lecture setting, we use the technology in a certain way, and if you're in a private setting, you use Zoom in another way, which could make it a bit more informal, and therefore maybe a bit easier to react, and therefore it's a bit more many to many. Okay, So let's get to the final part about the persistence part. We used to say that social media, that one of the core characteristics of social media was that it is persistent. So that everything you say on social media remains on social media and can be used by others for good or bad. So this is why many organizations define a corporate wiki or a discussion forum as social media, because it remains visible and it becomes kind of a corporate knowledge database to which people can add and react, and people can revise the content, etc. So we used to think that persistence was really the core of social media, but then came Snapchat, and then the definition turned around a bit. So we now say that in principle, for many social media, persistence is important, but we do see that persistence is sometimes more important, and sometimes non-persistence and anonymity is more important. Anonymity, I'll come back to an anonymity in the next lecture. Because you don't always want content to be persistent. And I think that's quite an interesting example of social materiality as well. Because social media content needs to be visible, but we always had a need for some content not to be visible and persistent. Then Snapchat was the first one to develop an app specifically with the ability to manipulate that persistence, and then all the other social media followed. So with Instagram stories and Instagram stories, and also LinkedIn stories, which they discontinued the day before yesterday, in order to create content that is less persistent. So I think that's pretty interesting. So and I think that is something very interesting for organizations as well. Oh yeah, WhatsApp also introduced the, yeah, that's true. Yeah, WhatsApp also introduced it. Yeah, thanks. But I think this is very interesting for organizations as well. And again, there is no clear answer, but you can imagine that in certain circumstances, organizations want information to remain visible, and that there is always some kind of top-down pressure for all communication to remain visible. So you have to communicate via Teams, because then we have a recorded log of every interaction between employees that can be searched and that can be used for other projects. But you can also imagine that within organizations, people want to sometimes communicate and they don't want it to be persistent. You know, they want to communicate face to face, or use their own private WhatsApp, so that the organization cannot see it. Because you can imagine that especially in very competitive organizations, people are less inclined to use Microsoft Teams because they are afraid that what they will say will be used by someone else or will be used against them. So in very competitive and very hierarchical organizations, maybe persistence of social media is not such a good idea in all cases. So I think the persistence part is very interesting. And now in organizations, you see a tendency to make, to incorporate social media, which makes basically all communication in your organization persistent. You know, everything is stored, every team interaction is recorded, and recorded is all the chats are stored and remain visible. And I think, at least I hope, that in a couple of years we see that those enterprise social media start integrating, you know, private options. You know, you can that you can set it to private, that you can communicate outside of organizational boundaries, etc. Okay, let's get back to the definition. So if you look at what social media is, because then I can explain the last one. As a broad definition, we say all mediated interaction, but that would make phone calls social media as well. But the more narrow definition is many-to-many, to a certain extent, user-generated content, and a certain amount of persistence. And all these characteristics are, to a certain extent, fluid. The gray thing here on the slide, which says internet-based built upon Web 2.0 technologies, is really the technical definition of social media. So what has made social media possible is the advent of what we used to call Web 2.0. So basically, the technical term was when we started introducing Ajax or Ajax, in which you could refresh and add content dynamically. That was introduced like 15 years ago or so. And that really spurred the development of social media. But that's really the technical definition. So for us, that is less interesting. We are more interested in the social definition of social media. And that is really the many-to-many user-generated content and persistence. There's one aspect of many-to-many and of social media in general that we haven't talked about, and that is the association part. And that may be also one of the most important characteristics of social media. Because if you look at, I think, all major social media you use, Facebook, TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, Teams, they all revolve around you having a network of associations. And that is the whole network logic of social media. Social media could not exist without associations between people. You need followers and you need to follow people on Instagram before you even have that many-to-many aspect. So the associations and the network part is really an integral part of all social media. You cannot create user-generated content if you cannot associate content with other people and other content. So this is what we call social media. Well, that took a long time, but I think it was an interesting discussion. So. Sorry, too clear in drawings. That makes the slide a bit more clear. So I think we already talked about it, about how we use social media in organizations. So maybe we can skip this part, else I really run out of time. Like Slack, Facebook workspaces, Microsoft Teams, even Slack are all examples of corporate social media, but you see in organizations that many people also use the private social media. So almost all organizations have WhatsApp groups or use other social media to communicate. And basically, if you basically the way that people use social media in organizations is very similar to how you use social media in your studies. So if you have a course, you create a WhatsApp group with your group. You have broader WhatsApp group for the course. You create a Google Doc which you use to work together on your paper, which allows you to, which is really user-generated content. You can write a paper together, you can comment on it, etc. So if you look at the applications you use as a student, it's basically the same what people do in organizations. They have corporate wikis, they have shared drives, they have Microsoft OneDrive, and they work together on a Word document. They have Teams. So if you want to think about organizational use of social media, think about your own use of social media. Yeah, let's skip this for now, and maybe we could do this now. I think we discussed most of this, but if you remember Monday, we talked about, okay, what are the changes in how we organize work due to the pandemic, and how do you think the newer generation is different from the older generation? Before the break, I talked about the whole strive towards more a natural, individualized way of organizing ourselves and working. Could you say something about what you think is the role of technology in this? So I'm wondering what you think about the whole deterministic versus constructivistic view. So do you think it's really social media and other communication technologies that has spurred the whole, that has changed the way we work? Or do you think it's the other way around? So what do you think? Do you think technology and social media plays a role in organizations, and how? Maybe a bit of a vague question, but if for example, if you can give an example about, maybe some of you can give an example about how communication technology that was incorporated in your organization, in the organization you're working, or maybe even an example as in a student project group, has really changed the way you work. Yeah, negative EWOM. Burnouts because social media managers can reach out more easily after work. Things. Yeah. I think this is really an interesting example of the interaction. The option to work remotely instead of the office. But do you think these things are caused by social media? And do you think that it sets unrealistic expectations? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so these things that are mentioned are quite interesting, because they all are the technology didn't cause this, but the way we used it. Yeah, exactly, Floortje. Thanks. So everything that is mentioned here is really the interplay between technology. Of course, negative EWOM can negatively affect an organization's reputation. That's always been the case, but it has been made worse by the persistence of negative EWOM. So the characteristics of persistence, so that everyone can see negative reviews of an organization or its products or services, has made negative EWOM worse. Change in work environments, because social media can reach out more easily. There was, of course, always the tendency for managers to reach out. You know, they always want you to work, and they always are in a hurry for you to finish something. But social media has made this more easy for your manager to ask something besides work time. Yeah, so this is really the interplay, and to give a short example of so we have a so we used to have, with our colleagues, we used to have one WhatsApp group, which was our departmental work group with our colleagues, and there we shared everything. But you would get those notifications, and even if you would set your the WhatsApp group to silent, you would still see the amount of unread messages. So you really had the tendency to always check the messages in that WhatsApp group. And most of the time it was fun, you know, funny pictures, complaining about students, those kind of things. But many times as well, people asked work-related questions. So they asked questions about papers, they asked questions about the formalities of grading, things like that. And we noticed at a certain point that many people, including me, got a bit stressed out at certain moments, because So we went to that WhatsApp group. So in the evening, so we checked the messages, and then we saw all kinds of questions related to teaching. And then we thought, oh my God, we need to do something. So what we ended up doing was splitting the WhatsApp group. And we created one WhatsApp group for, we call it the leisure WhatsApp group, and we have the business WhatsApp group. So in the leisure WhatsApp group, it's fun. And the business WhatsApp group, it's questions and remarks related to teaching and research. And that really worked for us, so that we could just, if we wanted to ignore the business group, but do check the leisure group. And that gave us less stress. So it's also, so we kind of appropriated the technology. So we structured the technology in a way that it was easier for us to handle. So again, an example of the interplay. I don't know if that's me, but I'm a different person on social media. But at work, I'm a more formal and proper. So I use media as a bit of a personal conflict, as it were. Yeah, it's oh, don't get me started. So this is what I research as well, but it's more like societal implications. So you know, we as people have multiple identities, and online we have more freedom to create the identities or the people we want to be in certain contexts, and therefore we can, therefore we can be different persons online and offline, and even different persons in certain different online groups. And next week on Monday, when I talk about theories of multimedia communication, we will talk a bit about different identities in different online groups. About setting a norm. If you see a colleague sending an email at 20 at night, you might set the tone that working late should be normal. Yeah, and that's also interesting. You see that if you start working in an organization, or if you start working in a new project team and you start a new WhatsApp group, you see those norms develop. So so sometimes you see that it's completely normal for people to remain in contact and to also in the evening communicate with each other. And in other WhatsApp groups, you see like a clear norm that that suddenly pops up, in which someone says, "For now, I don't think it's okay if we start sending, if we continue sending messages after work hours," and then a whole new norm develops. So it's really, it's not a technology, but it's the interplay. Technology makes it possible to communicate 24/7, but it's us who can set rules within certain limits. It's also the conference announcements, yeah. We did it go in a restaurant, a few points, yeah. Yeah, Anna, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, you still see the unread message of the business group, and that still gives me stress. So what we did during the holidays, so we had a period of, I think, 3 or maybe 4 weeks that our teaching load was relatively limited. So we dissolved our business group. So only a few people remained in the business group, like the core people, and a lot of people quit the business group. And since last week, everybody joined the group again. So it still stressed many people out, even if you when you set it to silent. Yeah, planning a text at a certain time. Yeah, you can also use that to your advantage as email, so that in Outlook you can set when to send the message. So you can just pretend you have worked late on a certain assignment for your manager. So you send the email to your manager at 2 at night and say, "I worked so long and hard," while it's just a scheduled message. Okay. I think we will discuss this in the coming lecture. So how can technology address the issues of working from home and leadership? Those are all basically the topics in our lectures to come. Because I want to explain a bit about the from the time we have remaining. Yeah, I'm sorry. again, I always, when I receive my feedback on the course I teach, I always get feedback that I'm a bit chaotic, and I am. So I'm sorry about that. I try to improve it a bit, but it's also a bit of my style. So we still haven't finished the complete lecture. Fortunately, in the lecture to come, we have a bit more time, so I can make up the last time. That's good to hear. So that's 1 in 85 people who think my lectures are entertaining. 2 in 85 people, 2%. No, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, thanks. So also it's important because I get a lot of feedback from you. So it keeps us thinking about what social media is. And I think us thinking about what is social media, what is not, how does technology affect us? How do we affect technology? I think that is more important than me just explaining what structuration theory is. So I hope you learned a bit of this lecture. So in the last couple of minutes, let me give you a quick heads up of the theories to be discussed, because they can be quite complicated, and it's good to have like a general idea now so that I can go more into detail next Monday. Thank you. That's very good to hear. I'm going to save this chat conversation for later, so when I feel down again, I can reread this. So basically, what we discussed in these last 2 lectures is really the interplay between technology and us people. So changes in society, changes in the way we work, changes in technology, and the interaction. And I will finish it next lecture. Yeah, not in this recording. So I'll do it next lecture. So, and you need to keep these discussions in mind when you think about social media. So also when you work in the organization, I think the example given about the use of Microsoft Teams before the break was a really good example, that if you implement Microsoft Teams, it will not magically be used, because you have to keep thinking about okay, what does the technology do and what can we do to affect the use of the technology? And the main issue with more popular thought about social media is that we tend to think in terms of applications. Oh, every other organization is using Microsoft Teams, we should use Microsoft Teams. Oh, we can use some kind of cool virtual reality thing in Facebook workspaces, we should try that out. So if you think of only those technological innovations and only think of specific social media applications, you stop thinking about, okay, but what is it about these social media applications that is important for my organization? Do I want to focus on the many-to-many aspect? Do I want to encourage more informal interaction using social media? Do I want to keep a written history of discussions about certain topics in the organization, create a common knowledge base. So focus more on the persistence. So you need to think about what are the characteristics of social media, what are the characteristics of my organization, and what do I want as an organization with social media, and how can we rearrange the technology in such a way that the chances are highest for it to be successful. And you can only do that when you think of technology not as a deterministic application, but you can only do that if you think of it in terms of technology having certain characteristics, and those characteristics are kind of fluid. So if you do it like this, focus on technology, focus on specific applications, you will have little attention to characteristics and interplay, which leads to the inability to explain or predict the success of technological innovation, and mostly leads to a deterministic view of the use of technology. But in order to counter that, we have adaptive structuration and affordances of technology, and we will discuss that next week on Monday. So for now, thank you very much for the lecture, and thank you very much for your feedback and for your interaction during the lecture. It makes those online lectures way more fun. And I'll see you on Monday again. Thanks very much.